Yeah, so today we look at mobile as an assistive technology. So all the ways that mobile phones are unlocking assistive technology. So the thing about mobile phones is that everybody has one. And on Thursday, when we talk about business models and business development, there's some facts and figures around GDP of countries and other things where you realize when something like a mobile phone is going to be affordable to most people. And then once that's been hit, it tends to be able to proliferate through society. And then that allows us, mobile phones have managed to do that because relatively speaking, the unit cost of a mobile phone is quite cheap. Whereas, for example, when laptops or PCs came out, they were quite expensive relative to the average earning. So you have that ratio. If you're trying to design something that's going to be universal, the accepted, you have to get that price point right that everybody can afford it. So, but mobiles can obviously be an assistive technology, can't they? Right? You can have a magnifier. So we were just talking yesterday. You were talking, yes, about the child that won't use assistive technology, but maybe uses a phone to magnify or holds the phone right here and doesn't want to doesn't want to use a screen reader because they don't want to look disabled, but equally they're holding a phone right here, really magnified so they can read something. And they're also putting their eyes under strain in the process, right? So they're losing eyesight whilst they're straining their eyes, but because of the stigma of being a partially sighted person, they don't want to switch, right? So on the one hand, it is an assistive technology. It can read things. It can translate speech to text, text to speech. That's great. On the other hand, it can act as an unlocker. So for example, one of the examples I have here is a population health survey that we've been developing. And that population health survey, normally we used to go door to door with paper surveys, and they're just very difficult to administer. And it's much easier if we can administer it all on one platform. So we've been working with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine to see if we can develop one tool that would allow us to do that. And also it acts as a gateway to information. So if you're a person with a disability before mobile phones came along, you might be literally the only disabled person in a village, for example. How would you get to know about other people or other things? And you just simply go to Google and we find out things. So I'm sure that even if you broke your leg and you were trying to figure out how to use crutches, you might quickly YouTube to see what you should do. So if you YouTube right now something like wheelchair skills, you'll see a whole load of wheelchair skills video. You look for I don't know how to use a screen reader. So somebody will have figured out some videos on how to use a screen reader. So people are accessing information much more readily, which is both good and bad in ways. Like on the one hand, it democratizes access to information, which is a good thing. On the other hand, you don't know that the information is excellent. Does that make sense? So you don't, like a clinician, you could be doing something that could cause harm, but you don't know. So we're going to have a look at that. So one of those, we'll look at specifically on methods. I picked out co-design because co-design within it, co-design is like a collection of methods. You can do lots of things within that. So I thought we'd work together in groups. I'm not sure how it's going to work in this classroom situation, but we'll give it a go to see if we could maybe design a co-design workshop for a particular population. And I have an example that we can use, which is with HearX, with people who, a hearing aid company. But we don't have to use that. That was just in case nobody else had something that they wanted to use. So that was the idea. And then after lunch, we'd come back, or maybe in the tutorial, we'd look at the information seeking for ALS and MND. So just looking very deeply at the problem of ALS and MND. And one of the reasons I wanted to go deep into one condition, it's very hard when you try and teach a course on disability because, what do? Do you spend ages explaining people all the different types of deafness, all the different types of blindness, all the different types of movement impairments, all the different types of cognitive impairments? There are so many, and then that would be the course, and it would be very medical. So the good thing about ALS, well, it's a terrible thing because it affects all of you, and it gets worse. But from an engineering point of view, that's quite interesting because it can cover quite a lot of different areas that we might want to design around. So that's the reason I've picked it. And because of that, there's a lot of information seeking that's done because people's conditions change a lot of time. So they're constantly searching to understand the information. So mobile as AT, when we first started this project called AT 2030, which is a flagship program by UK aid. And the idea was, so if you transport yourself back to 2018, there was a thing called a Global Disability Summit. Now, if you probably don't know what a Global Disability Summit is, do you? No. So I didn't know what a Global Disability Summit was, but apparently previously there'd been a Global Women's Summit, and that was meant to bring all the world's leaders together to say, how do we really make a shift in gender equality, right? And this one was, how do we make a shift in disability, equality? What can we do? Like, it doesn't. The CRPD, the UN Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disability, has been ratified by nearly every country. Nearly every country signed up. Nearly every country, or most of those, have a protocol for how they're going to deliver it. And still, if you look at most countries, in England, for example, there's always a 30% gap in employment. So disabled people are 30% less likely to have employment than non-disabled people. So, and that's relatively good. So it was like, well, we're not doing a good job individually. It would bring everyone together. Now, luckily for us, as GDI Hub, we just started, and it was on the Olympic Park. So the summit was held in London by the UK government, and the Kenyan government co-sponsored it. It was held in London, literally just on the site of the Paralympics, which meant that we got to know what was happening quite a lot. But also they put out a call for assistive technology. So the UK government suddenly realised it had done an awful lot of work in development around disability, but most of it had been around sort of welfare, access to employment, access to education. But they hadn't really thought about the technology aspect. They just didn't have any programs on that, and it was an obvious gap. So they put out a call for, can somebody help us, tell us what we should be doing in this area? And they actually put out 2 calls. And so we contacted them and said, I just want to let you know that the disability world is not a homogenous space. Like, there are lots of different powerful agents, and lots of people seem to have very strong views of what should happen. And if you have 2 calls, you might end up with 2 rival ideas. Does that make sense? I think it would be better to have 1 call and bring lots of people together to answer it, and then you might get more consensus. So they said that sounds like a good idea. We helped to lead that consensus building, and that led to a document that we produced, which was a scoping report on assistive technology, which laid out all of the barriers to assistive technology. So I won't go into today, but you can read it if you want. I can provide it to you. And on the back of that, they said, that sounds really exciting. If you can write a proposal in the next couple of weeks, we'd like to give you £10 million to bring that consortium together and run the programme. So we did. And when we got the £10 million, it was quite funny actually, because we just set up GDI Hub, and when we got told we got the money, I was with Vicky and Ian in Japan, actually, my co-directors. And I got the email, because I'm me, so the minute I got Wi-Fi, I checked my emails. And then I read this email and I thought, oh, that looks like we've just got £10 million grant. And so I went over to tell Vicky, and I have a photograph of her just going, like completely shocked. And Ian was there. And Ian's always like, Vicky, Ian and I are quite a good balance of people, of leaders together. And Ian just went, I shouldn't swear because this is being recorded. Swear word. We don't have a bank account yet. so we started our startup, which was the Global Disability Innovation Hub, with no actual bank account or no. We just sort of tried to bring together some good thinking. And one of the first things we did was say, well, we have to start looking at some sort of large-scale sector reviews, right? Because part of moving the agenda on disability is getting everybody on the same page, right? And even if you don't all completely agree, you have to sort of agree with a general direction of things. Otherwise, we're all just going to fight and pull each other apart, and nothing's going to move forward. So two of the first bits of work we did was a piece of research with understanding the mobile disability gap with GSMA and the digital assistive technology product narrative. Now, me and my team led the research bit of it, but we partnered with and gave the money to GSMA because we wanted the reports, firstly, to be industry focused. We wanted, GSMA are the association of all mobile network operators in the world. So if they write a report, mobile network operators are going to listen to them, right? And same with the digital assistive technology. We developed it in partnership between the 80-20-30 program and At Scale, which is the global partnership on assistive technology, the UN sort of association in that area, for the same reason, because governments are going to listen to the global partnership on assistive technology. So we wanted those audiences to get the right information, but behind the scenes, we also wanted to make sure that the research was very robust And so we will find even that understanding the mobile disability gap, we did that research in 2019, and actually it's on the back burner. It's one of those papers that we never quite finish. But we do have an academic paper going to Tokai, which myself and Julia and Sarah Pollock at London School have promised ourselves we will submit by the end of this year. But we do try to make sure that everything is at an academic, robust quality, even though what you might see is a sort of a shiny version, if that makes sense, because the shiny version can be accessible to more people. And so when we started understanding the mobile disability gap, we found there's a massive gap, right? And in the digital assistive technologies, we focused on 3, which was AAC devices, so alternative augmented communication devices, screen readers, and mobile phones. And so I won't go into the digital assistive technology one. I'll dip into a little bit more on Thursday around that business development, because it's very much about supply and demand and all of the levers. But today, I just wanted you to know that we had done these analyses, and in effect, the GSMA one we'd done work in Kenya and Bangladesh, 1,000 people survey, as well as some deep dives of 40 people sort of doing photo voice things. That demonstrated there is a mobile gap, right? But actually, when people were users, so the deaf community in particular, the deaf community consume an awful lot of data. They are brilliant customers. If you're a mobile network operator, you want deaf people, because deaf people use a lot of video. They communicate via video, they're using translation software. And so actually they become power users of mobile phones. And they're a really great like market for mobile network operators. So we were able to show usual things. Fewer women had mobile phones, especially in Bangladesh, less so in Kenya. And overall things like you had less likelihood of having a mobile phone, less likelihood of having access to internet, less likely to realize you could get internet on a mobile phone, less likely to own a smartphone. So all of those statistics, I'll bring in a little bit more to Thursday into that business. But that set the scene of that high level thing. We could go to governments and we could go to people and say, look, there's this mobile gap. But it didn't help the mobile network operators or the handset developers or the software developers know, well, if someone's got a phone, so what? What do they do? What's working? What doesn't work? How do you know if people are enjoying using their phone? So yeah, sorry, I forgot to move the slide along. So this was the work that we did with GSMA. Like I just said, survey of 1,000 mobile phone users, how many own a phone, which type of phones can they access, what services do they use, the barriers and counters, and how do mobile phones help. And it's 11% gap overall. That was 2019. 24% of people with disabilities had access to a smartphone. 46% needed help when making or receiving a call, for example, so it wasn't independent use. 53% needed help when texting. Only 22% could take advantage of accessibility features. And 62% reported that mobile phones enabled them to access basic services. So if you had one, it was a bit of a game changer. So these, for me, I remember when we were looking at these results, like my academic head was going, oh, this is really interesting, right? So it's really interesting to me that the mobile phone isn't just a thing that somebody owns, if that makes sense. So you probably don't share your phone, I'm going to guess. I use it. Very few people use my phone. A guy on a bus recently asked to use my phone, and it was I was like, yeah, I suppose so. His phone had died. He was traveling. Could he make a phone call? Yeah, but it was a surprise interaction. 10 years of living in London, it's the first time anybody random has asked to use my mobile phone. Otherwise, it's mine. Whereas what was clearly happening here behind the scenes was that that's not the type of interaction a disabled person has. So if we're designing a core technology, we're designing it with the wrong sort of use cases in mind, or we're designing in accessibility barriers that are causing odd use cases. So that was the first thing I was interested in. And the second thing was the idea of not being able to take advantage of accessibility features. Like, how was that happening? What, this number, I wasn't sure. What did that mean? Like, did it mean that they could, these very high level surveys are great for getting you sort of thoughts of where you might go with research. So I'm going to go through a case study of one of the things that we did immediately after that. So although we had £10 million, which sounds like a lot of money, I can promise you it's not a lot of money when you've suddenly got to give money to people like the World Health Organization and UNICEF and others, and you've got 58 partners over 5 years, it suddenly gets down to quite small pockets of money. And we had quite a small pocket of money to begin to scope the research that we would do in Kenya. So Kenya was an obvious focus of the research because they had co-hosted the Global Disability Summit. And so they wanted to make sure that the research would benefit Kenya. So we went to Kenya. On the one hand, we had 3 weeks in Kenya to set up a tech accelerator. So to see, could we start to develop who would be able to run this assistive technology accelerator, which we've now run successfully for 5 years. I think we've had 48 ventures supported through there. But being researchers, I also wanted to do a bit of research while I was trying to set that up. So we knew that people in low resource settings have challenging access assistive technology, but we also know that they can access a mobile phone. But we also don't know when they get a phone, really what are they doing with it? Does that make sense? Like really, how do they use it? So a question for you. So this is a sort of I'm going to give you the answers of what we did, but I also want to brainstorm with you what you might do, because you might have had a better idea. So how would you design a study to understand how people in very low resource settings use an assistive technology? What design choices might you need to make in the study design? Where would you start? Now, one of the first things we did was start with mobile phones. We decided that would be our topic, right? You could have started with prosthetics. You could have started with hearing aids, but we had decided on the back of the mobile work we would start with mobile phones. But then, okay, you've got mobile phones, got low resource settings. You probably need to do a bit more than that before you do a study. So any other thoughts of how you might begin to design this? Yeah. So these are all really good points. So let's see if I can remember them all. So we've got the first point, which is about looking across subpopulations of disabled people to understand the differences and similarities across the differences. Then we've got the idea that before you even go to design any study, you need to understand the context, and people's contexts are very different. So we would need to maybe hone in on one area, like one particular sub-context, right? So we've got the idea of sub-disabilities, if you like, types of disability, the idea of sub-context. Then we've got the idea, Roshni, the workplace, home, and other things. And then finally, we've got this idea of how we, remind me, my brain. What their need is, yeah. So we need to understand what their need is, right? So what we will do. Yes. So we were discussing this. Like, so what do we do and how do we do it? So the first thing that, so the first thing that we did was we went and spent a bit of time. We found a charity called the Kilimanjaro Blind Trust of Africa, and we'd heard of a few. So for example, I went to see maybe 5 or 6. So I mean, this isn't like I went to see one thing and went, oh, that's a good idea. I must have met, and Kenya is a funny place, right? I don't mean funny, it's just very different to say London, or it's very different to India, right? Whereas like I would be at breakfast at a hotel and people would come and sit down next to me and say, I've heard you're here. You don't know me. I work for humanity and inclusion. By the way, what you're trying to do, if I was you, I'd really speak to Well Told Story. They're a great outfit. They do this, right? Do you want me to do an introduction for you? So you would just sit for breakfast and all of a sudden your day would completely change, right? So people would come and find you in the evening and say, oh, by the way, we want to tell you what we're doing. Can we? So we must have met in 3 weeks, maybe 150 different partners, right? So it was, and they were very different. So there were people who ran AMREF, which is the Flying Doctors that have their own university, massive, it'd be like coming to IIT Madras, a massive institution in the area, right the way down to, say, Kilimanjaro Blind Trust of Africa, who effectively they roll out the Orbit reader, which is a low-cost Braille device. So they go to schools and they train people on that, and they also do livelihood employment opportunities for people who are blind and have low vision, and they do some education work for people who are blind and low vision, but their offices are the same size as this room. They're a small organisation doing quite a lot of good work. And then there was, like, I met 4 associations all in like one area, all to do with deafness. So it was like the Kenyan Association of Deaf People, the Deaf Association of Kenya, the people associated with deaf, honestly. And they were all in the same space. Does that make sense? And so you would speak to them all, but they all were very slightly different and had very slightly different roles. So we did a lot of that sort of stakeholder mapping. And you know, when I was asked once, how do we pick partners? And I mean, I don't know, honestly. I didn't have like some fixed criteria. It had to do with, I think, when I met people, I'm a person, it's like when I meet Sujatha, I think one of the reasons we've become quite good friends is that I really love people who have quite a good vertical in an area. So if you're very good at one thing, I think that's really brilliant, as well as just having a little bit of breadth to understand where your vertical fits and sort of knowing the limits of what you can do. Then I find it's easy to build a team around it. What I find very difficult in building partnerships is, you know, you meet some people and they can do everything. If you do everything, I don't think you can do anything. I'm not sure what you can do. Or they can do something very specific, but the minute you try to talk about anything else, they shut down. And so it's going to be very hard to build a cross-disciplinary team with those people. So I think it has a lot to do with the sort of culture and the personalities, but I don't think I had realized that until afterwards. But I think that's probably was my main criteria. And so KBTA, Kilimanjaro Blind Trust. So one of the things we started with was having these conversations. And what became quite obvious was that blind people and deaf people, if I'm honest, but blind people would obviously have maximum use of a mobile phone. Does that make sense? It would be it felt to us like that would be a population that would get the most possible benefit. And we had a partner in KBTA who we felt we could depend on to do good user research. And what I mean by good user research is that they were able to, they just were really embedded in the communities. Does that make sense? Like they just knew people in the communities. So imagine now we've decided that you want to run, so we decided that we would run a small study to start with blind people, blind and partially sighted, but blind people for making the sentence a bit smaller, in an informal settlement, so a very low resource setting. And this was going to happen in Kenya, but you know, the same study could happen in India. So then we had to think, what methods would we use, right? So, and we partnered, we always have a university research partner in the area where we're working so that the ethics can go through local things, and also we get local academic inputs as well. So that tends to be the three bits. We have a community partner that's able to work with the community. We have a local academic partner, and we have us, and we sort of tend to work together. So it was us, Kilimanjaro Blind Trust, UCL, GDI Hub, and University of Nairobi. And so whilst we'd sort of decided this on our 3-week trip, we then had to get ethics, right? So what we needed to do on the 3-week trip was really decide what everybody would be comfortable with in terms of designing, like what do we think would work in the study? And then we would be able to apply for ethics, and then we would be able to come back. And then we were planning, well, if we're going to come back, because of what you said, actually, we wanted, you know, obviously other people can do the research. I mean, and there's a real tension actually when you're designing studies like this, and it's emphasized because of the color of my skin and then the color of the skin of the population I was working in, right? So I would be the white academic, is, you know, relatively wealthy compared to the local black people living in an informal settlement. And that power dynamic can be a bit strange. You know, people can sometimes, well, they can, yeah, and some people don't mind, but some people won't want you there. Does that make sense? So on the one hand, you want to be there because you want to understand the context. Like, otherwise, how do we co-interpret the results, right? But on the other hand, you're concerned that if you're there, you might just skew, you know, the sort of balance of things. So, and so there was 3 of us, 3 researchers, in the end when we did go back. Katie, who was a master's student who was working on the project, Julia, who was my PhD student at the time, just become a postdoc, working on setting up the accelerator, and myself. And I only went to 1 or 2 of the studies. So I was like, if there's 3 of us, it's just going to be ridiculous. Does that make sense? It's going to outweigh the number of local partners. So we have a lot of considerations of that. But before we got that far on those smaller sort of nuances, what methods would we use? So I don't know if you know Cabera. I've got some slides that will show you Cabera. I've got these first, so they come in different voices. So here's just an idea of how we could have collected data, right? So we could interview people. Obviously, I wouldn't interview people because I don't speak their language and they don't speak my language. So, but you know, local people could interview people. We could have interviews. We could do a focus group. Does everyone know what these are? Interviews, focus groups? Yeah? Cultural probes. Does everyone know what that is? Yeah? No. So I didn't know what that was when I was an engineer before I came into computer science. So a cultural probe, my partner really laughs at this word. She's like, computer scientists are the only people who could design something which is meant to be like a way of exchanging information and call it like a cultural probe. It's like how, like what are you doing? But the cultural probe is like, so the interviews, if I talk to you directly, I get some information from you. But normally after an interview, I don't know if you've ever done an interview, but afterwards you might often think, oh, I forgot to say, oh, I wish I'd mentioned this. Because you just talk about one thing and you maybe forget to talk about another thing. So an interview is great because it allows people to go off on tangents. It allows you to semi-structure something, but give a bit of flexibility to how the person wants to engage. And it allows you to have a rigid enough structure that you can analyze the results thematically with some rigor, but it's not too rigid that people feel like they're just doing a survey and being quizzed. So interviews are great for that. And a focus group can be great for almost building on ideas and trying to get consensus of ideas. Does that make sense? So you mentioned one thing and that helps to spark something in someone else, which helps to spark something in someone else. And actually, if they'd all heard each other's interviews, they would have had slightly different opinions, or they might disagree with one another. And so rather than me analysing 10 interviews and thinking, well, we've got this theme which is vaguely positive and this theme which is vaguely negative, if we'd had a focus group, maybe people would have argued those points out a little bit and you would have got more subtleties between those two ideas. But of course, focus groups can be very difficult if people don't want to speak. And so in some cultures, people would find that an intimidating situation, or the mix of people can be intimidating, or you can just be really unlucky and get one participant that just dominates, and it's very hard to get them to be quiet. You know, they keep contradicting or they're arguing. So focus groups are great at sort of building that consensus, but neither of those help you understand sort of everyday life of people in the moment. So in the moment, if I'm researching, say, I don't know, travel behavior between India and the UK, right? My flight, I mean, it was such first world problems, but my flight from London to Chennai, British Airways annoyed me on 3 separate occasions, right? Infuriated me on 3 separate occasions. The first occasion was when this infuriating woman told me that I couldn't pass through the barrier to go through security because I needed to physically print my visa acceptance for the Indian government. I said, I've been to India many times, you no longer have to do that. I know you don't have to do that. They don't care. No, the Indian government tells you have to do this. No, you need to go, like, walk half a mile that way, go to a print shop, pay 20 pence. Like, I was just like, this is insane, I'm not doing this. So anyway, in the end, I just walked to the first class desk because I assumed the first class people would be better informed. And I just said, oh, I'm really sorry, obviously I'm not flying first class, but I'm not checking any baggage. Just wonder if you can just quickly check my visa. Man went, because man has nothing to do, because there were no first class passengers. But oh, of course, madam. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you very much. Here you go. Thank you. Thank you. But in that moment, BA will never get my feedback on that, right? I'm never going to be annoyed enough by the time I get to my hotel or even on my plane to like write a letter of complaint. I'm just not that type of person. But it was annoying because I knew they were wrong. I knew she was wrong. And I needed to get through the other side because I needed to get on a call. And I had like 7 calls before I had to get on a plane. And they were all quite back to back, you know, so it was just a bit infuriating. But if you're British Airways, if you'd had some sort of like a cultural probe, might be, you might have a postcard that just says, when we annoy you, let us know when. And it might have a picture of like a really annoyed person and another picture. You might have a different postcard that's got a really happy person. You might have another postcard that's got when you felt most safe, for example, on an airplane, or you thought the place was cleanest. And you could just scribble on these. So if I had that, if I was sitting on the way to standing in the next queue for security, I probably would have filled it in, right? And if all I had to do then was scan a QR code or something to give it to them, I might have done that. So a cultural probe is where you get a kit together and you deliver it to somebody. And it should be quite exciting that when you open it, it's like, oh, what's all these things? This is very exciting. But each thing in the box should probe you to give a bit of information that's critical to our design process thinking. So if, for example, we're British Airways and we're trying to figure out when do our customers have maximum frustration with us, and also when do they feel most likely to want to book again with us or something, we might have some happy stars, or we might even have a little chart of the entire journey, for example, and some stickers, and ask people to just put some stickers on after a journey and after a week, and then send that back to them. It used to be, they also used to have a camera. When they were first created, cultural probes had one of those cardboard disposable cameras? They were like, it was the same time when these were developed, the same time. So the other thing would be that people would take photographs of random things that would be exciting or not exciting to them. And then you'd have all this data back. But the thing is that it doesn't just exist like that. You then use it to have further discussions with the participants. Does that make sense? So if, for example, I wanted all of you to come today and we were going to discuss, I don't know, accessibility of the IIT Madras campus, and for the last 2 days, I'd given you a camera, you'd gone and taken some photographs of things you liked or disliked, you might have had some postcards, things that you thought were good or bad, there might have been, I don't know, like a stupid toy that you put next to something that's really good and a different toy. You tried to make it fun, basically. And then you would all come in and we'd put all of these on the walls. That would spark conversations that you wouldn't get if you just sat in a focus group and said, so tell me about IIT Madras accessibility. Does that make sense? It would spark the bits that you're not going to get. So it gets over the obvious. Because what most people start with in the focus group is, well, the lift was broken. Lifts are always broken. I'm not calling out IIT Madras. Like everywhere you go, a lift, the common accessibility problems are somebody parked in front of the doorway, the lift was broken. And it would get round all of that to something that you wouldn't have expected. So a cultural probe is a set of things that help you probe in the moment, emotions mostly, and then you're trying to get under that emotion to understand what activity a person was doing and why it frustrated them, so you can really delve into a pain point. An experiment is an experiment. So normally you've got different control variables and you've got the variables that you wish to measure, and off you go. So examples with the train experiments, we used to have 3 different door widths, maybe different profile of age of people. So we'd have people who were maybe older in one experiment, profile would be skewed to over 50. In another experiment, we'd have people skewed to under 30. We'd test 100 of those people getting on and off a train with 3 different door widths, and we would see what impact those variables had on dwell time. And then we would be able to run some fairly basic statistics, like an ANOVA, to understand, well, there's a statistical difference between these groups, and then we'd be able to recommend you will save 5 seconds per dwell time of a train if you increase the door width by 10 centimeters. And then the engineers can go back and decide, well, 10 centimeter bigger hole will cost us a little bit more money because it's going to be this much more expensive to reinforce the rest of it. But the dwell time will mean that we'll save some money over here, and they can make those decisions. And from a design point of view, we might run something where, for example, we test a digital platform, different color contrasts, different text sizes. We might want to test different populations, like you said. So do hearing impaired people use mobile phones more than blind and partially sighted people? So the issue with experiments, of course, is they have to normally be controlled. So the opposite of that is going out in the computer science world. This is the other one that my partner laughs at because she says, well, you can't, she thinks it's very funny that only computer scientists. So, when you say in the wild, have you heard the term in the wild? So in the wild in computer science means we went outside and we just saw how people do things in everyday life, right? But it's called in the wild. There are research books about designing research in the wild, which really just means how people are using things in real life. And so, yeah, my partner's always like, only computer scientists can think like stepping outside of the lab is like the wild. Like that's just life. And then, but yeah, so in something like in the wild research, you might use something like photo voice. So photo voice is where it's almost, it can be included in a cultural probe or can be completely separate. It's a separate methodology by itself. But a photo voice is where you get people to use photographs to capture their voice. So over a week period, you'll ask people to take a number of photographs to sort of capture. You might say, just over the week, can you capture a typical day? And so whichever day feels most typical for them, they'll take maybe 10 photographs to say, this is when I was dropping my child to school, this is when my grandmother came round, this is my trip to the grocery store, this is, these are the things that I do. And then you're able to look at before you get everybody together, you would print all these photographs and you would sort of put them up on walls and people would be able to come in. And especially in places where having physical photographs is a luxury. Does that make sense? It can be really a lovely way to do research because people really value the physical photographs of their life. So they're already getting something back from the research because they're getting something that they wouldn't have had already. Plus they're getting to really show the full context of their life. So you're really getting to understand all the little things that you might not see every day. Design fiction is where sometimes people get stuck in a rut. So I don't know have you ever done interviews with people? I don't know. Like, imagine you have chronic pain. Like every day you have really bad pain, and you get people who have chronic pain together, and you're doing a focus group or an interview, and you basically, you're trying to get them to co-design, trying to get them to think about what could we do differently. Like we're developing a new sensor. We've understood some muscle problems around your lower back. And we've got this new technology that we're going to put on that heats and gives some haptic feedback or helps you. Like I know some people who did some really good work on sonification of movements because people get scared to move because the pain's so bad, they get scared to move. And because they don't move, the pain gets worse. So by using sounds, you can kind of like encourage people to just move a little bit more. So, you're trying to encourage people to maybe think about how would we design this? We've got this idea. And sometimes if you've just been living in one scenario, you can only talk about that scenario. So everybody just goes back to, oh, well, there's no point in designing anything because let me tell you the pain is so bad. Let me tell you how bad my pain is. And from a psychology point of view, what they desperately need is just to be heard about their pain, but they're not really able to help you co-design because their pain, both physical and psychological, is so great that they're just telling you the same stories. Or you get people who are really angry. So they just like to tell you why, society is against them, which it is. So, yes, and it's horrible. And yeah, if your everyday existence was that many barriers, I'd be angry too. So yes, but it's still not helping us co-design. It's like you're still stuck. So sometimes design fiction can be quite nice because you try to write a bit of fiction and say, like, imagine it's 2050. And we are giving this lecture in IIT Madras. What would have changed to have improved the accessibility so that we would have 90% disabled people in the room? And suddenly people, because it's 2050, because you've given a sort of an overall massive aim that feels quite ambitious, you have to set it just far enough that it doesn't feel like you're going to get bogged down in, if it said 5 years, somebody might say, well, I don't know, because there's going to be a general election and we don't know who's going to be, Modi might not be in power and then we don't know. And then they'll just get distracted by some other big thing. But if it's 25 years, they can't imagine, we can't imagine all the problems. So it helps us just begin to think about solutions. It's like a trick for the mind. So it can be quite useful. Observation is great. Has anyone ever been observed, like hospitals, observations, like people have come around and observed you? I mean, I'm not sure people really, you have to be careful with observation if you're doing observation. Like if I really observe you, don't mind me, I'm just, I'm just checking how you pay attention. I'm just looking, ignore me, I'm just so if you're doing observations, you have to think about how you're going to do them in a way that's not so intrusive, yeah. And obviously there are ways of doing observation now. There's an entire house in the UK that's funded, which is set up with so many sensors that when you go to the toilet, it's analysing what's happened to, your bowel movements, your urine, it's analysing that. It's analysing what you eat out of the fridge. There's cameras everywhere. And people like to go there and live there for a week or two as part of this general experiment because they're trying to think, they do set experiments, like they might be looking for biomarkers of dementia or biomarkers of stroke recovery or something. And then they have people go and live in this house for a serious time. But it's quite weird being observed like that, right? That cameras. And We can also observe people, and that's a mixture between observation and analytics. We can also observe people, say, with a smartwatch, right? So, I mean, technically, I am giving data to Apple all the time, right? But I don't really feel observed. Psychologically, I don't feel observed by Apple because I feel like I am one tiny, tiny dot in this massive cloud, right? So I don't feel as it's intrusive. Whereas, for example, I remember one of our PhD students at UClick, she was working with people with dementia, and her whole project was around designing technologies for people with dementia. And she wanted to see maybe could we track, this is going back a few years, like maybe we could track where people go and then the effects of dementia on geolocation. So her way of checking that, and the idea would be that, let's say I have dementia, that data would be shared all the time with my partner, so that they could always come and get you if you got lost. So she decided it would be a good idea to test that. So she wore the sensor that had been created. And so for 2 weeks, she shared her data with her boyfriend so that he would know, and then she would know what it felt like. And she said it was really interesting because, like, even though, for example, she'd be leaving UClick, our office, and she would say, she'd be on the phone to him and say, oh yeah, no, I'm going to stop off and see so-and-so for coffee, and then I'll pop by Tesco's, I'll get something for dinner, and I'll see you, I should be home by 8. So even though, obviously they share what they're doing generally, the fact that he could see exactly how long she spent for coffee and how long, she was like, it felt really intrusive. Like, she was like, I don't want that level of tracking. Like, I just don't think anybody would ever want it. So then why would it be ethical to give it to people with dementia, right? So we've got this idea of observation. So observations obviously can be good. I've done work with people in sleep laboratories, for example. So sleep apnea, when people get night terrors and they sleepwalk, and we were developing sensors to help measure that in the home. But obviously they have a lab at the hospital where they go to sleep in the bedroom and everything is measured for 48 hours because they're trying to understand what's triggering these things. And so for short periods of time, probably none of us mind being monitored by clinicians for 24 hours or 48 hours when we're trying to get to a diagnosis. But in everyday life, we probably don't want it. So we have to be careful with it. Yeah, analytics, we share data all the time, but again, that data can be, we have to be careful what we collect and how we share it and how we aggregate it. And then we can do co-design workshops. And co-design workshops can have elements of this. So for example, people who would have done photo voice and bring that into a co-design workshop. We can do mini interviews or mini focus groups as part of sort of co-design, but most of the time we're trying to actually co-create. So given all of that, it's quite a long explanation. If we go back to what I was saying at the beginning, which was, what would you do, right? You're suddenly going to go to this place called Kibera, which is 250,000 people in Kenya. So probably, I'm going to guess, that most of you haven't been to Kenya. So you were like me. I didn't know Kenya. So you're going to design a study. You need it to run over 1 to 2 weeks for various reasons, because of budget constraints and because, just because you're various windows of different researchers that you're pulled into this pilot project. So, what would we do? So this paper, The Social Network, How People with Visual Impairments Use Mobile Phones, Kibera, was a Kai paper. And so I'm going to tell you what we did. So first of all, we went back to the research and we looked to see what had been done before, just to double check that we weren't going to answer anything that had already been done. So we knew that low-cost basic solutions had been designed for challenges ranging from navigation to social media. We also knew that despite the ultimate advantage of transitioning from a basic phone to a smartphone, it's a difficult process. And we also knew that phone and ecosystem barriers, those ecosystems determine how the phone is used. So that wider ecosystem is the point, which is the point that you made, right? We're going to have to really delve into this ecosystem. So when we looked at the literature, it made us think a couple of things. Are we focusing on smartphones or feature phones? What happens if when we look at people, we come to meet people, they've transitioned from feature phone to smartphone? Do we decide that we want to only speak to X number of feature phone users and X number of smartphone users? Do we only pick one ecosystem, right? So we sort of went from that side in, or from this side in, from here in. Here we decided it's definitely going to be, Kibera. That's definitely what we're going to do. Here we decided we didn't mind. And the reason we decided we didn't mind was it was an initial study, And it was going to be too difficult to find smartphone users. We didn't think in Kibera we were going to have smartphone users. And we weren't sure which people would have a button, a feature phone versus a standard basic phone. So, and we weren't sure that even if people had a feature phone, they would know it was a feature phone. Does that make sense? And we didn't, how did we know that bit? We knew that bit from speaking to our local partner. So the people from Kilimanjaro Blind Trust said, you know, we've worked in Kibera many times and people won't know the difference between these two things. Like they're just going to have a phone that you'll ask them, is it a smartphone? They'll know it's not a smartphone, but then you'll need to ask them, like, do they get onto internet? And you're almost doing the study by the time you're getting the basic information of recruitment. So we might as well just go and see what people are using and then figure it out from there. So that's what we did. So we also knew that the social context shapes the technology use and the disability experience, and that human infrastructure in the social system in which technology is used. So this idea of human infrastructuring is something that came out of HCI for development, where previously, if you look at HCI in resource-rich locations, we tend to develop solutions that are very much about independence, one-to-one use. I have my iPhone, my iPad, whatever I have, I use it. I watch Netflix, I search YouTube, I create content, I share content, right? But as people started developing and understanding how do people, there's loads of studies in India actually, how do people use mobile phones in India, especially minorities within places, right? So previously it might have been women in India or women in Bangladesh. And so when you begin to look at that, you realize that people, for example, in Bangladesh, as an example, oftentimes women don't own a mobile phone. They have access to a mobile phone. Their husband will allow them to use the mobile phone, but it's not their mobile phone. Does that make sense? And so therefore it's going to change the profile. And so there'd been an awful lot of work in previous years looking at, for example, the gender gap on mobile, right? And GSMA had led that. And in all of that sort of research, academic research, this idea of human infrastructuring had come up, which was actually the community is much stronger in what people call the global south, but you could just call it better society. But they're more cohesive, that community element still exists. So people still work as a unit. They still live in maybe multi-dimensional homes, as in they've got grandparents and children and parents all living together, which maybe is not the case in, say, the United States anymore or Europe. Not as much, it's not as prevalent. But because you've got those community elements, you'll see things like in Sierra Leone, there was a project once where they tried to move an informal settlement. So an informal settlement was always just one tier. You're not going to build multiple tier houses in an informal settlement. And the government tried to relocate to sort of four tier blocks of flats, right? So technically, those flats have electricity, they're safer, they've got sanitation, they've got running water. So you would think people's standard of living would be better in those flats than it would be in an informal settlement where electricity is hacked, it doesn't exist. There are no toilets or sanitation facilities, there's just an open latrine. There is no running water, you've got to walk to the standing pipe to get water. And yet most of the women did more badly, that's not correct English, but anyway, they did worse in the flats. And one of the reasons for that was on the ground floor, if I have a baby, I have two babies, and I'm Sujatna, I'm good at sewing, right? Sujatna's good at sewing, I'm good at making cookies, cakes, right? We live opposite each other on this street. And I've got 2 kids and you've got 3 kids, right? And all of a sudden you need to go and buy more thread or more cloth. Well, you just pass over your children to me. I can also sell my cookies still out the window. I don't have to leave my home to sell these things. So people who live on that very day-to-day basis where they're producing enough and they're selling enough, or they're doing just enough to get just enough income to feed their family, that all happens on one interconnected street. And the minute you put it into a vertical, all of those employment opportunities go away. And in order for that person to get any work now, what's that woman meant to do? She can sell her cookies online? That's just not going to happen. I mean, yes, ultimately maybe she could, but it wouldn't be enough to move her from one place to another place. She would need digital skills training. She would need to understand how the logistics of doing all of that. They would also need to organise childcare facilities within that unit, and none of that was thought about. We just moved people into what was like some sort of criteria of set things, where all of them would have preferred to be back in Kibera. And there's a lot of people in Kibera, when I was in Kibera, who have the opportunity to leave now but don't want to leave because that's their home. That's their life, right? They've lived there for 20 years. They've earned enough money now that they could move out, but actually, all their friends are there. Like, they don't want to leave. So that social infrastructure, that human infrastructure is really important. And previously it had been missing from studies. And so it's important to notice. So this was one of the things we brought into this. And the big thing was that recently, probably number 2, 2010, when Sambasivan, I bet you can say that better than me, but when they did their paper, when they first mentioned these types of interactions, they started saying, actually, there are these things called surrogate interactions, like when I have to borrow a mobile phone from somebody. There's enabled interactions where I need to use a mobile phone, but I don't know how to use it. Could you just call this person for me? So you're enabling it. And then there's like translated interactions where people are translating in order to use it. And so we sort of brought that as our theory, if you like, into this practical study is, okay, so do we see surrogate-enabled translated interactions in this population? Or do we see other interactions, or what happens? And so in terms of getting an idea of the context, these are some photos that we took. So just at general informal settlements, the top right, that won't go out of the green screen. This is Kibera. That's the wall of Kibera. You can see there's cars parked here, and I'm standing taking this photograph on a 3rd floor block of flats where some people have left Kibera to move into those flats, right? And then this is a standard view of a dog lying on a street in Kibera. This is the type of mobile phone place that you would be able to go, but no matter where you go in the world, there is always a mobile phone stand now. You can just buy a mobile phone. I think actually the bottom photograph, I'm not sure I took it in Kenya. I think I might have taken it in Indonesia, but it was an informal settlement, right? So when you're going into an informal settlement, you know, people are poor, but generally less poor than rural communities. There's going to be loads of overcrowding, which will help in some ways that human infrastructure. That dynamic social structure exists and is amazing. There will be a lack of basic services, and the things are going to constantly change. So going back to your variables and like an experiment, you can never control for anything because, you know, literally halfway through the week of doing this. So one of the things we did to help make sure this study was well designed was KBTA helped us employ 2 people. So one person was a local blind man who lived in Kibera, that they had worked with many times before and was a bit of a community leader, and so knew people. And the second person was a person who lived actually in the block of flats, which I took that photograph from, who was one of those people who used to live in Kibera, but had recently moved out just to that block of flats just outside, but still ran 2 shops in Kibera, just selling the goods he'd always sold, which was mostly beds. And it was known to everybody, and so therefore would be able to help us, you know, move around and do things. And halfway through the study, just talking about those changing things, was on day 2 or 3, the young man who's the blind man who lived in Kibera, his house burnt down, which is very common because the electricity's hacked, and so it's quite common for places to burn down. But when we got there, we spent hours trying to recover all the pages, because the thing that he was most upset about was the fact he had a Braille Bible and it was destroyed. And so we spent a very long time going through rubble, collecting bits of the Bible and trying to put it back together. And we ended up like getting about 2/3 of the Bible back together. But it wasn't even that he wanted, you know, we could have bought him a new Bible, but he'd had that Bible all his life. You know, it was one of the first books he'd learned to read. It had always, you know, when things had been difficult, when his wife had got sick, you know, that was his thing. So things like that can just derail. Like, I've never had anything like that happen in the middle of a research project before. So things like that can change completely. So you have to be a bit adaptable, because obviously the study that day went in a very different direction. So we wanted to answer these 2 questions. How does the social environment, getting back to your point, so we really wanted to focus on that environment of visual impairment in Kibera, shape the way people interact with their mobile phones, and what kinds of interactions would people like to have if they were given any technology? Like, what is it they actually would like to be able to do? So that meant that we had these research methods. So for current interactions, now what are they doing now? We'll go back to those methods before. What we did was contextual interviews the current interactions were contextual interviews. So contextual interviews meant that we went to them. Before that, we spent a day with the two researchers I was talking about before in the KBTA room. We went through the process, we role-played the interviews. So we got them to be able to interview. So basically, we were not going to do any interviewing. They were going to do the interviewing. The local people, the local guys from Canberra were going to do the interviews. And actually, the guy who does the mattress shop, he ended up being obsessed with cameras. He loved our cameras. We had like small cameras. And so he became like, he decided he would take photographs of the environment for us, because obviously I'm not going to take out, I don't know, my iPhone and start taking a photograph. So, but he can take photographs. So then we explained to him, that's okay, you can take photographs, but we can't see any faces. Does that make sense? We're not allowed to see faces of like random people on the street. That's not, we can't do that. But he was still able to get some amazing contextual photographs of, like, say, this elderly blind woman navigating across the street. Like, there was shots that we would never have been able to get, and it really helped our analysis because it helped us remember. Because once you transport yourself back to London, it's quite, you don't get, it helps have all of those all of those images. So the contextual interviews happened in people's homes, which tended to be, or wherever they chose. So if they didn't feel comfortable having people come to their home, we would sit in a cafe or like at the side of the street or something. And then we did what we called an ethnographical observation. So that was really us just asking them afterwards, we'd love to see if you felt comfortable just doing something with your mobile phone or any activity that you normally do that uses any of your assistive technology. And we'd love to just see how you manage to do that in this environment, if you don't mind. And nearly always they were delighted. So they say, oh, that's good, because I needed to go to the shop anyway. Come on, let me show you, and then they would tell you everything. Like, they'd give you the history of that street and when they moved there, and, oh, that's this man over there. But what was amazing is they knew everything. Everything. They even knew the sounds of, like, oh, that's that child. They knew that child. Does that make sense? Like, because they knew their area really well. Then if we needed to, we did additional interviews. And they happened when, for example, when one person went to top up their mobile phone at one of the shops, and they happened to say to us, this guy, he's been amazing. If it wasn't for him, I would never be able to top up my phone. And as we would say to the man, we're doing the study, would you mind if we asked you a few questions? Here's the consent form. And we would just do these ad hoc additional interviews. For the future interactions, we did co-design workshops, which we'll come back to after the break. So there's only, I think, 5 slides, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back to the co-design workshop after the break. So the current interactions, basically, independent mobile use did happen. So we had this idea of direct interaction, which enabled independence. That's what those two words mean. So the first word is like the type of interaction, and the second is like the quality of it. So we had independent mobile use, not just mobile, but technology in general. So people might have a radio, they might have a television, they independently used that. Most people used physical buttons or screen. There's one screen reader user. They only ever used basic functions on the screen of the phone. Even if it had voiceover type technology, they never used it. They didn't know how to use it. They didn't know it existed. So they only ever used buttons. And if they got a text message, they would shout out the window and ask. So for direct use, they mainly used it. They'd saved 2 or 3 numbers. They had those on speed dial. That's what they used it for. And they could answer a call. So that was the main direct interaction. And when you spoke to them about what that meant, it meant I keep in contact with friends and family. Basically saved numbers up to about 9 on a phone. Whereas supported interactions happened when they needed advice on how to use things. So it tended to be a specific person. Now, it might be a family member, or it might be, there was a guy who did computer science at the local technical college, and he used to fix people's computers in the local area. And so he was, for one person, the go-to person, and they would trust him. So if they got a new phone, they'd go to him. Does this work like my old phone? Or they'd go to that one family member. So it was always like this really trusted person. They'd ask those people, they'd also often ask people as well to help replying to text. So if they get a text message, like you'd say, well, so what happens if you get a text message? Oh, I just shout out the window. Can somebody read? I've got a message. And so somebody would come and read the message. They found that being able to just ask people genuinely helped them feel confident that they had a community that supported them. So it wasn't to them a negative thing that they had to do this, even though you might think it was a negative thing. They didn't say that. They were like, no, this makes me part of the community. And there was always this point of reference within the community that they felt they could go to if they needed help. Dependent interactions, which really needed trust, were when they needed to ask a complete stranger who was not part of their community circle for help. It was often around banking. That's just baking, excuse my typo, but banking, not baking. It's when you shared sensitive information. And what they would do, their way of developing this was they would go to, like, for example, the place where you top up your mobile phone. And they would test it by asking, can I have 1 rupee? The lowest denominator. And then they would see, did their phone get topped up with that amount? Because they have no idea what the person's doing. And not only that, you have to give your passwords over to the person sometimes as well for them to top it up. So they would start with small things and they would build up that trust. And if at any point somebody took money from them, they would not use that shop and then they would move on to the next shop, right? So that was a sort of dependent interaction. It wasn't something anybody ever wanted, whereas the community interactions were everyone was very happy with those. They didn't want them taken away. And then finally, there was restricted interactions. So that was generally like people couldn't use some features of a phone because the accessibility features weren't there, or the cost of devices or services were too high. People would say, well, yes, I know that my phone can connect to the internet, but I would have to pay for internet, so I can't afford to pay for internet. Low digital literacy, a number of people said to us, only I had one of those talking phones for blind people. And then we would say, but your phone talks. What? My phone? What do you mean? Like, this feature phone can talk. But they had this idea that it was some sort of mystical thing that was like a flying car for us. Like, well, if only I had a flying car, that would be great. But it literally existed, they just didn't know. The low capabilities of the handset, some things, even though they said they would do things, just didn't do things. Like the one smartphone was so bad, I wanted to throw it against the wall. Like the UX was so laggy that, like, even if you used the screen reader was completely out of sync with what was on the screen, so it was just ridiculous. They always result in exclusion of the person, and generally people felt frustrated and disempowered. So we're going to come back after the break. So we sort of figured all that out, and then we wanted to try and do a co-design session. So when we come back, you can answer the question of, like, how would we then go back to those research methods? We've used some research methods to get some insights, into the area, and now we want to design future technologies with people and see what they come up with. How would we do that? Which methods might we use? Okay? We stop for a bit. I get away from these